everybody. My name is Dionisia Ramos. I'm the Vice Chair of the Center. I am pleased to introduce our speaker today. Alison Post is an Assistant Professor of Political Science and Global Metropolitan Studies. Her research focuses on the political economy of development, the politics of public policy, and subnational politics in Latin America. So thank you very all for being here, and I'll turn it over to Alison.
Great. Thanks very much for the introduction and also for making it all the way over to this center rather than Barrows on the 5th floor for the presentation. This talk is going to be drawing on some work that I've been doing with Veronica Herrera, who's actually a graduate of the PhD program in political science here at Berkeley and who's now an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut. And what we're looking at is decentralizing and corporatizing water and sanitation in developing countries. And this is a work in progress, so please, we would love any comments and suggestions that you have at this stage. Okay, just to start off with an image of probably the most common image that comes to mind when we think of the politics of water and sanitation in developing countries, particularly for experts on Latin America, as we have in this room, we probably think of Cochabamba, Bolivia, right, and the water wars that infamously brought the privatization effort that the municipal government there had been involved with to a halt very soon after the granting of a contract. Major social disturbances that ultimately funneled together and helped fuel a broader social movement in the country that rolled back many of the market reforms that were introduced in the late 1990s and ultimately culminated in the election of Evo Morales. I put this up here to say that while this is a very important image to take away with respect to the sort of reform initiatives that have been going on in the water sector in developing countries, it's not representative in quantitative terms, in terms of the types of institutional reforms that were most prevalent in developing countries over the last 20 years. So in particular, if we look out the ground, and these trends are actually not terribly well documented, and that's one of the objectives that we have in this paper, which is trying to establish a preliminary empirical base on this issue. The first trend that's been very important is decentralization of service provision from large national government bureaucracies in many countries to state or particularly municipal level governments. And the second major trend has been a set of institutional changes which, like privatization, were designed to insulate service providers from direct political influence from elected officials, but through public sector reform. And the sort of most extreme variant of that was called corporatization, so the idea of setting up a legally independent service provider that was still owned by the local government, but was often even incorporated under private law rather than public sector law. But the idea is basically establishing a formal legal basis for independence that would allow the service provider to operate without political influences. And the reform objectives in both cases were improvements to service provisions in terms of coverage and in terms of the quality of services that were being provided, and at the same time allowing for the introduction of what are called cost recovery policies. So policies designed to ensure that local service providers actually take in sufficient fee revenue to cover at least operational costs, and it's sometimes even investment costs that needed to build new treatment plants, to build new trunk lines, to extend household connections to citizens that did not have coverage. I would say this is particularly important in the sanitation area, where coverage deficits are actually much higher than in water. So these are the reform objectives, the reform initiatives that were actually much more common, and I'll be providing documentation about where these reforms occurred as we move through the talk. So in this talk, I'm going to cover 4 basic points. The first is to provide an outline of the character of service provision, sort of a very gross generalization of the common problems that were affecting service provision before these 2 reform waves were introduced. And then I'll go into the actual logic that was used to promote these 2 types of reforms, decentralization and what we've called insulating reforms, to basically provide for greater service, greater autonomy, political autonomy on the part of these service providers. Then we do what is, to our knowledge, the most comprehensive documentation of the uptake of these reforms to date. And we make the following argument, and this is pitched at a public policy audience rather than a political science audience for the political scientists in this room. But what we'd like to argue, based on our review of all of the existing academic literature that goes into the effects of decentralization and these insulating reforms, is there's basically a tension between these 2 reforms that existed at the level of how the reforms were actually justified in terms of the causal logic, how these reforms were actually supposed to provide greater incentives for good service provision, and that this tension that we see at the level of rationale has really borne out in practice, that there's really a fundamental tension between decentralization, which, as I'll go into later, was primarily argued as a means of bringing service provision closer to the people so that you had greater citizen pressure on providers to deliver services effectively, and these institutional reforms that were supposed to provide providers with greater autonomy from everyday politics. Okay, so let's get a sense of the backdrop prior to this 1990s reform wave. As I mentioned previously, developing countries very commonly managed urban water and sanitation systems through national bureaucracies. Now, this isn't every single country. This is a generalization here. But if we think sort of from the post-World War II period through the 1990s, this was the dominant model. You did have separate independent service providers at the subnational level. It was very common in the 19th century, but as we move into the import substitution era, following World War II, there are many efforts to basically put together these national champion providers that were sort of viewed as having part of the it was viewed as part of a nationalist economic development project to have a national bureaucracy in place that could basically take on this very important project of extending services throughout the country. Now, these providers, I'll show you some data from a few countries in a minute, were able to make very impressive headway, particularly in the 1950s, 1960s. There's some variation by region in terms of the amount of headway, with greater progress being made in Latin America than in Africa, for example. But very impressive gains were made by the international providers. That being said, coverage achieved was not universal, and what you had outside of the system of formal networks administered by these national bureaucracies were webs of informal provision by non-state providers. And I'll just mention Debbie Cheng, for example, has been doing research on this topic and knows much more than I do about it. So, but to an extent, we had webs of both private entrepreneurs, but also user-owned cooperatives, a variety of institutional modes outside of these formal networks. So by the time we reach the 1990s, this is just documenting in the Latin American case the sort of coverage expansion that was achieved in the interval between 1960 and 1990. Chile, for example, at one end of the spectrum, moving up to reportedly 100% coverage in urban areas by 1990 in both water and sewerage. Colombia not doing quite as well, more at the lower end of the scale. A case like Peru, moving up to 70% coverage in urban areas. Now, it's important when you're looking through these cross-national statistics, they're really not very good, the data that we have to get at these figures. Even the census definitions for what constitutes urban varies from country to country. The World Health Organization's Joint Monitoring Project has done some work to try to make definitions more comparable across countries in terms of getting good coverage data. But to an extent, if we just take a broad brush look at the numbers, though, even if we can't pin down exact figures, it's clear that substantial progress was made during this period. Problems, however, began to emerge with this centralized model of service provision by the 1970s and 1980s. And a number, if you read the historical literature on this topic, as well as the reports that were sponsored by the development banks in the 1980s and 1990s, which were admittedly written with a particular slant, the inventories that they did of systems in this period suggested that basically the emphasis of investment had been overwhelmingly on new infrastructure, and particularly in network expansion rather than maintenance of existing infrastructure. So you had pipes at this point that were 50 years old in many places, major problems with water leakage. Often 50% of the water that would leave a treatment plant would not make it through the entire system. And an increasing reliance on general tax revenues rather than user rates to fund systems. This is obviously geographically regressive if you have rural areas or less central urban areas not actually being within this national network. But often, even more than that, it makes the actual utilities, at these national level utilities, it made them vulnerable, right? They didn't know from a given year to year if they would have sufficient funds to actually maintain their systems adequately. And then as we move into the Latin American debt crisis and debt crises in other regions in the 1970s, 1980s, you have basically this problem where national governments were increasingly unable to subsidize these national providers at the levels that were needed to keep systems in good shape, but also to keep pace with increasing urbanization. So we have this sort of critical situation developing, and this slide is out of place, but this is meant to give a sense of the fact that if you don't live outside if you live outside of the formal network in this period, you're basically in a very difficult situation, right? Rates, which were not increased to keep up with inflation in many cases, were quite low if you lived within the network. If you are not fortunate enough to live inside the network and you have to access water through an informal provider, you're oftentimes paying 10 to 20 or even more times as much per liter for water, right? So a highly regressive setup in terms of the conditions under which the urban poor, those living on the urban fringe, can actually access services. So Safetoff and Spiller had famously termed this situation that had developed as a low-level equilibrium, characterized by low prices because consumer rates hadn't been increased to keep up with inflation, low quality levels because these providers didn't have sufficient funds to reinvest and maintain system, limited service expansion, operational inefficiency, and corruption. You had this sort of feedback process by which politicians were very involved with day-to-day management. Citizens actually didn't feel a very particularly strong incentives to actually pay their bills because they didn't feel like the money was being used effectively. They were receiving low-quality services, et cetera. So we have this situation in which consumer willingness to pay erodes, which further aggravates the problem. And just to give you sort of an anecdotal sense of how this worked in provincial Argentina before the 1990s reform wave, a typical utility, because of low-level corruption with the people that were actually administering expansion and new network connections, you would have about half of existing customers would actually be on the books as official customers, because many of these households had reached an informal agreement with the person actually registering new connections, not to pay the connection fee, and then this person would simply take the fee, right? And payment rates for the rate of the percentage of people actually paying their bills in a given month, 30% perhaps, right? So you have a low fraction of the population that's actually even receiving a bill is actually paying the bill, right? So you have, and then if you look at the balance sheets for these companies, all of the money is going to personnel, right? And very, very little going to investment. And on top of that, subsidies coming in from the general revenues to actually keep the company afloat. So again, I'm giving a very gross characterization of the way things worked at this particular historical juncture before the 1990s reform wave. And there's more literature on Latin America to actually sort of sketch this out than in other regions. But basically, you have a particular political economy problem, right, in terms of how to manage these utilities more effectively. This is just a state of coverage in 1990 to give you a sense of where the situation had gotten to by that point in time before the reform wave started. And I just wanted to point out that the main problems in terms of coverage were in low, middle income and low income countries, and particularly if we move over to the sanitation side, right? And sanitation, as most of us know, is extremely important for health outcomes, right? And the debate overwhelmingly focuses on access to water, which is extremely important, but this is the other piece that sort of underlay the reform initiatives in the 1990s, the recognition that, significant progress needed to be made on that front, the sanitation front. So economists and policy analysts working with the main international funders for the urban water and sanitation sector developed two main reform proposals for addressing this low-level equilibrium. And I'll spell these two out, but the first was decentralization, and the second was isolating service providers from political influences through a variety of institutional reforms. So just to go through decentralization, the main rationale, and what we did was an extensive, to really tease this out, was we went through the main policy documents that ended up being most influential, most widely cited during the 1990s, to sort of to provide an intellectual underpinning for these reform waves, and looked at exactly which rationale were being cited in these studies. And with respect to decentralization, overwhelmingly the emphasis was on increasing user participation, and the idea was that would improve provider responsiveness to local preferences and conditions. Secondly, by decentralizing, users would become much more aware of resource constraints, right? They would understand the fact that it might be necessary to raise rates in line with inflation, because they would have a sense living in the locality that investments were needed, that there simply wasn't enough resources and general revenue to support education, water and sanitation, et cetera, et cetera. And that user participation, the extent to which decentralization could be used as a means of increasing user participation, this would actually allow to generate user buy-in for cost recovery policies. And by cost recovery, I'm meaning things like enforcing bill payment, so potentially cutting off services if you fail to pay your bills, increasing rates so they actually cover the marginal cost of service provision. Now that could be varied with some sort of cross-subsidy situation in which different income groups were charged different amounts, but the idea was raising tariffs enough to sort of cover at least operating costs. Various initiatives to make sure that everyone actually receiving services was actually receiving a bill through aerial photography efforts, et cetera, et cetera. So this was the variety of initiatives that it was felt that if we increase user participation, it's more likely that we'll get some buy-in for these sorts of reforms. Now, these documents do make some important caveats that local governments actually need sufficient funds to be able to take over services, particularly if there's going to be some period before which you can actually get all of these cost recovery policies adopted. And secondly, that economies of scale are important. We wouldn't necessarily expect every village of 2,000 people to be administering a complicated water system. Probably more at the level of 50,000 or 100,000 people is a viable size. So these were the main rationale used to justify decentralization in this period, and it really rests on a specific political economy argument. And actually, I should emphasize that these arguments were in line with arguments made for decentralization in many other policy areas at that time. So when we look at the actual extent of decentralization during the 1990s, what we see is a combination of external and domestic political incentives prompted a broad set of developing countries to decentralize services to intermediate or municipal tiers of government. So we've documented at least 34 cases of decentralization in this period, and given that a number of countries already were administering at the in a decentralized fashion, this has basically taken us to a situation now where decentralized service provision in the sector predominates, with central and intermediate tiers of government retaining important financing and regulatory roles. So I was actually, let me start out, I made a handout because this didn't come across well in slide format, and I didn't expect this large of an audience, so maybe we could have some sharing here. But these are the cases that we've documented basically through going through all of the documentation available on development bank websites and academic studies and a number of other sources that are listed. So basically the after situation, and there are some studies actually that do a decent job of summarizing the contemporary institutional setting rather than decentralization as a process, shows us that in all of the African countries that this particular study, which is a UN-sponsored study, that they cover basically 100% of full or partial management at the local level, at the subnational level, excuse me. Asia Pacific, all of the countries that they included in their study, Eurasia, and then Latin America having a few cases where we still have provision at the national level, but these are obviously very small countries. So decentralization is the new kind of institutional reality in terms of provision in the developing world. If we move on to the second reform initiative, that was this idea of insulating service providers from politics. So policy analysts working with international financial institutions, again, if you go through the reform logic as it's introduced in the studies that were advocating reforms, really attributed to these service problems to a lack of political autonomy for utility managers. And again, these arguments were consistent with a broader set of critiques of statist economic policy that were being advanced at that time. The rationale was that basically if we isolate these providers from elected officials, we're going to be able to solve a number of problems. First, we're going to stop having patronage employment within these providers, which is basically increasing our personnel costs so that they consume too large a fraction of ongoing expenditures for these entities. We are going to depoliticize rate setting for consumers, make it so it's no longer a topic in election campaigns. By basically putting it in a separate entity that presumably is not influenced by elected officials. And this is going to pave the way for the introduction of these cost recovery policies. Now, here again, it's very interesting because often within the same publications you have both reforms being promoted when the rationale are quite clearly in tension, right? I mean, here we're isolating provision from electoral politics, from elected representatives, et cetera. And in the other case, we're actually trying to encourage community participation. So a set of specific institutional reform proposals are based on this diagnosis in the order of the efficacy that the writers felt that they would have. So the first and sort of mildest reform would be transferring services to a special purpose department within a municipality or state government. So the idea is that the budget line items are separate. They're sort of a separate departmental budget, and you're not necessarily sharing trucks and other equipment with the police force and with all these other forces, right? But there's some sort of separate division, and you have a separate sort of command structure for these systems, right? The second and sort of more significant reform would be transferring services to a special purpose government. So the analogy in the United States would be a special district government. The idea is this government entity is incorporated as a separate political and legal entity than the city government or the state government. A third model would be actually corporatizing the provider, so setting this up as a publicly owned company, right, that is potentially incorporated under private law rather than public law. And then the third option would be actually outsourcing provision to private or nonprofit service providers. So it could be a contract for private sector provision, as the opening picture of Coach Obama hinted, or to a nonprofit service provider, such as a cooperative, right? So, and just to clarify, the logic was that the idea is the further out that you go on this spectrum, you're more insulated from political pressure, right? Okay. And just within, I just wanted to clarify that even within that privatization category that was viewed as the most insulated from political influences, the idea is that certain modes of privatization would ensure greater insulation. A short-term management contract where you simply brought in a firm to basically take over the managing of commercial functions for your system, perhaps also some maintenance functions, wouldn't isolate the provider nearly as much as a long-term concession contract in which the private firm basically had investment and maintenance responsibilities, as well as responsibilities for all of the commercial aspects of service provision for a very long period. These are usually 30-year contracts, so this is a more significant delegation in terms of the time period, in terms of the types and number of activities that are being handed out. To at the sort of most extreme end of the spectrum, a divestiture, where you're actually setting up a company that owns the physical infrastructure, right, which is the privatization model that the UK adopted in the water and sanitation sector. And then these would be separate companies that then could be listed on the stock exchange, et cetera, et cetera. So to what extent were these types of reforms adopted? Well, they were promoted within a wide set of developing countries, including those with weak state capacity, few checks and balances, et cetera. Going through the policy and academic literature on this topic, we were able to identify at least 21 developing countries that engaged in corporatization as opposed to full-out privatization, sort of setting up these independent state-owned companies with appointed boards. This being said, this has been very poorly documented, and when we interview people working in the lending department of international financial institutions, they testify that this is going on much more than privatization and continues to go on. But in many cases, the data is not public on this. So the KfW, the German Development Bank, for example, does a lot of work supporting corporatization, but there isn't sort of there isn't a publicly available sort of compilation of all of that activity that we could go through. Private provision, which the World Bank has done a fairly good job of tracking as it's happened, has affected approximately 5% of the world's population. There are projects in 61 countries, but the pattern that you see is it tends to be a few cities in most countries rather than a very extensive transformation of the entire sector, as we saw in Chile and Argentina. So what have been the experiences to date with reforms? What we did was analyze the existing scholarly literature on both types of reforms to get a sense of how, in particular, the fact that these reforms are often adopted in tandem influenced the way that they played out. And first, I just want to say, in terms of impact on outcomes that most of us think about first when we think about the impact of these sorts of reforms, outcomes clearly vary. So effects on investment, on expansion and service coverage, on improvements in quality, such as the number of hours that water might be available during a given day. There's absolutely no consensus in the literature, and you have a number of contradictory studies, sometimes even looking at the same case, and particularly with the case studies that are more qualitative, it's often very difficult to if you're not an expert on that particular case yourself to know exactly which conclusions are correct. But there are a number of lessons that are emerging about the politics of how these reforms are playing out that comes across very consistently across the academic studies that have been published. And that really shows that the decentralization and the simultaneous introduction of these insulating reforms is clearly in tension in practice, particularly when we think in light of the rationale that was used to promote them originally. That new modes of political influence upon service provision following decentralization have made it very difficult to introduce the sorts of cost recovery policies that these insulating reforms were supposed to set up. And I'm just going to spell out this argument a bit more. So just if we look to the literature on decentralization, there are mixed findings with respect to the extent to which writers have found that user influence has increased. So some studies say actually participation hasn't increased much since decentralization, and others really point to numerous instances of which it has. The one very interesting thing that comes out, though, is that oftentimes the very institutional setup, the specific institutions that are set up to facilitate user participation are often not very well utilized. So there's been a tremendous effort on setting up boards to sort of bring in consumer representatives and encourage feedback on how policies should be developed, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at the existing case study literature, suggests that actually it's much more informal participation that's been much more common. Street protests in response to policies actually being adopted, backroom political pressures from political representatives from particular neighborhoods on the elected representative with whom they work to dial back reforms, et cetera. What this means is that politicians have often pushed utilities to respond to consumers' short-run interests rather than long-run concerns. So we can imagine your typical consumer has a long-run interest in improvements in service quality and a short-run interest in not paying for that, right? And so it's this issue of trade-offs between long-run and short-run, as well as the distributional choices with respect to what percent of what fraction of the population is going to pay more than their share to ensure that the less fortunate half is able to enjoy services as well. These studies also point to a number of coordination difficulties between tiers of government following decentralization, and problems with economies of scale and cross-subsidization. Basically, when it becomes clear when you look at the data that in many cases services were decentralized to very small providers, and then you really lose this ability to have sufficient economies of scale to cross-subsidize very effectively between poor and more fortunate jurisdictions. So in particular, if we focus on the case studies in which decentralization was adopted, and then subsequently these efforts to corporatize the utility were made, what we see is that corporatization under these sort of circumstances really fails to provide for de facto political independence. That local governments are still influencing hiring within these entities, as well as how budgets are allocated, that local elected officials are still blocking utilities from raising consumer rates or tariffs out of electoral concerns, and that local officials, following pushback, are repealing more significant cost recovery measures following political protests. And I'll just give you a case study illustration. There's been quite a bit of work on the Colombian case, where utilities are managed primarily at the municipal level now, and where over the last 20 years we've seen a major effort to introduce these corporatizing reforms. There's been some privatization, but actually there's been a very, very significant amount of these reforms within the public sector in the Colombian case. And here we, again, following these institutional efforts, we see continuing problems with patronage appointments, that water tariffs remain an issue in electoral campaigns, and this really leads to reluctance to introduce these cost recovery policies. So in other words, and I don't have it here, but what really comes across as well is this sort of this heightened level of political engagement and awareness, which really, in our mind, stems from the fact that once you decentralize to local level, there are fewer major policy items on the agenda, and local services like water and sanitation end up being one of the major electoral issues, whereas if you had this issue managed at the national level, you'd be competing with national security and inflation and all of these other topics that people care about. In addition, the central offices at the city level for the water company or provider are very accessible for various types of political protest in a way that they wouldn't have been if the main office was in the capital. And so you have this, in a sense, this very volatile and volatile political environment in this policy area that sort of comes from trying to implement these two types of reforms at the same time. So just stepping back, for those of us that study political economy, these results are not particularly surprising, right? These are weak institutional environments with few checks and balances in the broader institutional environment that would really ensure that legal provisions for provider autonomy are respected in practice. And as I just mentioned, following decentralization to a tier of government where governments have fewer responsibilities, we would expect this issue to receive greater political attention than it did previously. So just to step back and conclude, institutional reform initiatives in the water and sanitation sector in developing countries really promise to correct incentive problems that had trapped providers in this low-level equilibrium. The idea is on the one hand, we're isolating service providers from politics via corporatization or privatization, so that utility managers can really focus on doing their job. And on the other hand, we have this idea of decentralization, making service providers more accountable and bringing consumers in, consulting with them, making sure that their preferences are really respected in terms of service delivery. This paper, to our knowledge, provides the most comprehensive documentation of the extent to which both reform efforts have been rolled out to date. And our close reading of these IFI publications suggests that the principal rationale used to promote the reforms were actually in conflict with one another, and that the emerging literature on the effects of reforms suggests these tensions have really been borne out in practice, and that we're really going to need to think hard moving forward in this sector about how to accomplish what's really important, which is, yes, ensuring that citizens have an influence on service provision, but at the same time, figuring out how to ensure that sufficient funds actually go into improving facilities and that these funds are well managed. Thanks very much. Any questions? Yeah.
Do you have any sense, you mentioned earlier that there were more informal hookups or unregistered hookups, and the cost recovery, the fee payment was very low. Do you have any sense of trends in that under the reform statistics?
Right. So there, I guess I'd better continue to stand for this. There, I have a much better sense of what's happened following privatization than I do in corporatization, because the case studies that have been written to date on corporatization haven't really focused on that aspect, and neither has most of the work on decentralization that we've collected. So following privatization, as you can imagine, the companies that took on these contracts had very strong incentives to actually improve these user databases. And actually, the typical contract would have included actually a requirement that firms do inventories and improve their consumer databases and actually put it in an electronic format that might not have existed previously, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I could say with confidence in Argentina, where you had 14 provincial level providers that were privatized, that they all did aerial surveys, and so if you take the expansion statistics for the first year, that actually doesn't correlate with new physical connections, but that's actually their efforts to update the consumer database and then claim credit for that in terms of network expansion. Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, great presentation. I'm glad to see you continue to work with Veronica on this stuff. So I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more on the distinction between the rationale between these policy areas and practice. I was surprised on this slide to see the strong statement that the rationale are contradictory. Because, I mean, we can imagine sort of decentralization to promote participation in a way that it's actually used to keep policymakers accountable, but not used for rent seeking or not used for capture. I mean, this is sort of the holy grail of decentralization and participation type policy. So perhaps that was the rationale, was to have a sort of a decentralization that led to accountability-inducing participation, but not the sort of distorting, rent-seeking, screwing up the way water was delivered type of participation.
Right. So if you go back to the documents, the arguments are not made in as specific of terms as you've just outlined, which was, of course, be very sensible to do, right? And it's more sort of positing a general association that they would expect to see. We decentralize, we therefore see greater incentives for individuals to participate, or there are greater opportunities for individuals to participate, and therefore we expect service provision to improve. But I think we're clearer about this actually in the paper than I was in the presentation. I mean, it is very interesting to distinguish these, the experiences to date, the extent to which they've been documented with these institutionalized community participation or user participation boards that were supposed to do exactly what you're describing, right? Provide a setting where you basically take all of the major NGOs in the area, have representation, you have some sort of political representatives on the board, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is to really try to bring everyone's perspectives and needs on board in setting policy, versus the sort of less channeled and perhaps, I don't want to say less constructive, because in many cases the protests actually were legitimate in terms of helping dial back policies that hadn't been thought through very, very well. But this less institutionalized mode of participation, which really made making any progress in terms of introducing the cost recovery policies extremely, extremely difficult. So I think, but I appreciate your comment, because I think in the paper we need to be very, very clear about that. Yeah. Yes?
I apologize if people are already a little bit more familiar with the term, but can you clarify some of the points about corporatization and exactly how it's distinct from the other forms of
Yeah, let me go back to the slide. I mean, there is some debate in terms of what how exactly to define these terms, and we've gone with the definition that Karen Bacher at the University of British Columbia tends to use for corporatization. But we could think about this in terms of a spectrum that these institutional reforms could take, that basically the idea is to isolate service providers more and more from influence by elected officials. So the first is simply setting up a separate department within an existing government, and basically ensuring that existing department has a separate budget from year to year that they can work with, right? And that their income stream sort of stays within that department, right? So the user fees aren't simply cannibalized by the municipal government in general, but they're actually sort of devoted to that service area, right? Actually, I should, okay, yeah, so here I apologize. We could think about each of those elements I mentioned, but sort of having a separate department and then separate department plus isolated income stream, right? Then we could imagine the special district model, which is very commonly used in the United States, where the services are not actually managed by the city government or the state government itself, but there's a separate governmental entity that's incorporated as it's a legally independent entity that actually has responsibility of service provision, and there would be some process by which governance for that entity was determined. So in two common models, for example, are having an elected board for that government, so everyone within that area would vote for whoever the board of directors would be for that. Or you could imagine a system of appointments where all of the municipal governments in that area would each appoint a director to that board. And so these are set up in different ways. Corporatization then would be setting up an independent company, but the idea is this independent company is state-owned, right? So the state owns all or at least a majority of the shares. So we do have some interesting models in Brazil now where these are state-owned companies, but 49% of the shares have been listed on the New York Stock Exchange, right? So the Sao Paulo system is managed that way right now. And then sort of further out, so just to something different from corporatization would be outright privatization, where you're basically delegating management to a private sector company that is not owned by the government. And as I mentioned before, there are a variety of forms that delegation could take. Was that clear? Yeah. Yeah.
To get us too far off topic, but I'm looking at this spectrum.
Yeah.
And for some reason, I've been reading a lot about Argentine water. It seems like corporatization and outsourcing contracting out should be reversed in place. I mean, I wonder, because once you've privatized, you have a target for blame. Right? And
that's one of my book arguments.
Yeah, I might be borrowing some things from you. So I'm wondering.
So that's what I'm trying to do here is sort of work with the arguments that were originally made about what we would expect the effects of these would be. So the expectation was if we delegate to a firm, that's going to be even further removed. So if you look at actually how the reform documents are typically structured, they're like, if you can only get so far, at least do this. And if you could do this, this is great. And the silver bullet solution is this, right? I mean, that's the way. There's like, it's literally an order as you move through the document in terms of, what they think you should be trying to do if you look at the 1990s publications. But you're right. In practice, regulation is not at all apolitical, right? Yeah. Yeah. Debbie.
Thank you for this talk, Alison. I'm wondering, in your review of documents, you've probably seen a range of efficacy of corporatization. So I'm wondering if you could maybe highlight some of the factors that might contribute to that, and to what extent, like a strong state, strong regulation, strong government.
Right. So what we've seen so far is a general correlation between sort of state capacity and check. If we were to sort of take the World Bank checks and balances score and have a continuum and sort of locate these cases, we can't fill in, very much of that spectrum. We have a few isolated cases, but our general sense after reading these case studies is that when you corporatize and basically the entire state apparatus is centrally controlled by the mayor or the governor, and there really is the judiciary essentially responds to the governor, and everyone else essentially responds to the governor, right? It's not going to do anything if you have that sort of environment, right? Yes?
I thought you would take us through the political economy of reform, namely how do you make those reforms incentive compatible for a local government that looks at water as an electoral trump, right? That you certainly don't want to surrender. So you need some compensatory mechanisms, I suppose, some tax reform or some alternative ways by which electoral additions are So if you look at the political economy of implementation, are there success stories where you see what kind of complementary institutional reforms you need to place in order to compensate local governments and prevent them from continuing to interfere with
right. With respect to corporatization, there is a literature that looks at determinants of privatization, and there some of the strongest predictors are actually need for the cash to invest in your system that the World Bank or the national government would be offering you at that point in time, in addition to sort of partisan ties with the national government, which is actually promoting these reforms. But if we look at the corporatization literature, there's very little work actually getting at this mechanism, and Veronica's dissertation is one of the few that does. And what she found in the Mexican case when she was looking at uptake of these reforms was that there were essentially two things that made it much more likely for municipal governments to actually sort of implement not just corporatization, but also these cost recovery policies. And the first was that the state government had actually set up a decent institutional apparatus and framework, including financial incentives to do so, but also doing much more mundane things like having a standard tariff formula that you could basically just download and implement, right? With a particular set of expectations for, what different categories of consumers could pay, and having sufficient material on how to manage a utility well, an independent utility, in terms of setting up boards of directors and operational concerns, that you basically have the in-house technical advice that you needed at the state level. And as well as sort of passing all of the enabling legislation that you might need. But the second piece that she found is that basically it was much more likely to occur where the mayor in charge, or the mayor at the municipal level, that his political support base came from business and the upper income distribution. And that he or she had some expectation of staying in office beyond the three-year limit, which is the term limits in the Mexico case, that party there was some expectation that party would continue in office. So basically much more difficult to implement, and circumstances under which the majority of your electoral base is going to suffer some sort of financial repercussion. Although it seems like, and this is one thing I've been surprised about with her analysis of Mexico, it seems like they didn't really explore a lot of creative cross-subsidy arrangements that might have made it possible to introduce cost recovery measures in a fashion that would have been reasonably palatable to the urban poor. I mean, it seems like there could have been some formula that you could have found where business was cross-subsidizing very, very heavily, and you could have made it work. But apparently they, were not thinking that creatively at the municipal level in Mexico. But in any case, that's what she's found in the Mexican case. Yes?
You mentioned the World Bank.
Yes.
Are outside funders very influential? Are there situations where outside funders are more influential in setting the terms, and are the terms usually for corporatization?
So this is in the first half of the paper when we were outlining the reform rationale. These are reform rationale that were really articulated by the main international lenders and donors. So World Bank, but also the regional development banks, also organizations like USAID, which have given a lot of aid in the water and sanitation sector, the GTZ, the German Technical Assistance Agency, et cetera. So, and yes, they do have quite a bit of influence, although I think that to actually pull things off there has to be local political will to make things happen, right? I mean, you can provide financial inducements and technical assistance. That's what outside lenders can do, but without a local champion who wants to make this happen and follow it through, these reforms are not going to happen. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned the case of Argentina, where 14 provinces have been gone through this privatization system.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The question is, has the rate of service increased for the population under that scheme? So
there have been a number of studies of this. I should say that privatizations in most of the provinces have actually been reversed in Argentina by now. So it's sort of been gradual since the Argentine crisis. But there are now only four contracts at the provincial level in Argentina. So we're assessing kind of a particular window, right? That's 10 to 15 years in most cases. So there have been a number of evaluations of how those private utilities have compared to public utilities operating in Argentina. And of course, we have the difficulty of comparing apples and oranges to a certain extent, because certain provinces chose to privatize and others didn't. And but the most well-known paper is one by Galliani, Shargowski, and Gertler, which basically argues that child mortality rates decreased at a faster rate in the provinces that privatized. their systems within the and they're very careful actually in their analysis to just really look at the areas, because when they privatized, it would often be a subset of the province that was receiving services from the private provider, and they're very careful with their boundaries to kind of make sure that they're really capturing, the actual treatment, the privatization, and comparing that with like cases. That being said, having worked in Argentina myself, there's incredible variation among these private sector providers. So I think it's really, oftentimes we think public versus private, but it's just as important to think about different, drivers of differences in public sector performance and drivers and differences in private sector performance. So even within these 14 Argentine cases, we have cases in which basically the negotiating relationship between the private firm and the state government foundered right from the outset, and there was very little investment. And then we have other cases in which 1.5 million new people were brought into the system within the first 3 or 4 years, right? And so we have cases of really massive investment. And it's important to kind of think carefully about these differences and to think about it in terms of the viability of the political relationship and sort of the institutional viability of privatization, and in terms of the actual service improvements that are being generated. And yeah. Anyway, does that answer your question? Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
You don't have to give a lengthy answer to this if you don't want to, but Mexico's on the verge, or at least seriously discussing corporatizing Pemex. Right. And this is totally different from a service, right? We don't have consumers that are concerned about service delivery or their fees, but there are stakeholders. There are the Mexican public that is interested in the government getting more tax revenue from it. Right. Does your study have any lessons for Pemex or for a non-service industry, and what are the conditions under which corporatization can be successful?
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the reforms in Pemex are actually just for, it's just contracts for specific, it's not to corporatize Pemex itself, it's for specific activities and projects, right? It's a revenue sharing, or not even revenue sharing, it's like service provision contracts for particular exploration efforts, is that correct?
I mean, so imagining them more around the table than that. As it is now, yes, it's sort of more modest ideas of increasing external investments in Pemex.
Right. Well, I would say one difficulty that is common to both of these sectors is that we essentially have monopolies, right? And one of the primary reasons why privatization is supposed to improve performance is the competition mechanism, right? And so Demsetz has this classic argument that basically if you make people compete for the contract, right, that's some sort of substitute for actual market competition. But what we've seen in weak institutional environments is we have incomplete contracts. Basically, regulation amounts to an ongoing process of contract renegotiation, right, rather than sort of a contract that's enforced at any particular time. And so that's where I think, much will depend on the credibility of the framework that the Mexican government sets up to actually manage these contracts, the extent to which both parties envision themselves working with each other over time, sort of outside of this, we can imagine there's a 3-year contract to do X, right? But this particular company, they may have incentives to do a better job and honor the terms of their contract if, they envision working with Pemex in the future, et cetera. Similarly, on the Pemex side, if they find this investor to be providing them with technology that they find helpful and doing good work, there are ways in which in the literature in relational contracting and economics provides some nice insights on this term, right, on this issue, is that the extent to which there's expectations of an ongoing relationship that can help. And so we can imagine if they were designing the system, they might make it clear that there will be, rebidding for new things at later periods, and that sort of provides everyone with an incentive to play nicely in the first round, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are ways in which you can structure things in that setting, which are actually easier than perhaps in water, although the tricky thing will be the extent to which they're requiring the firms to make very large upfront investments, right? Because usually you kind of want, contracts tend to be more long-term in those scenarios because you want sufficient time to actually sort of make back everything that you put into the project. So they'll have to think through quite carefully, I think, how they set up that system. Yeah.
Thank you
Great.
so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.